My mother-in-law sold my grandmother's $25,000 antique jewelry collection to pay for her gambling debts, then told everyone I was being dramatic when I got upset. What she didn't expect was my Delta Force brother-in-law coming home on leave and discovering what she'd done. Here's how one woman's greed led to the most humiliating confrontation of her life, and how my family finally learned the truth about Delilah Brennan. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I never thought I would be sharing a story like this with strangers on the internet. But after everything that's happened, I need people to understand that sometimes the most dangerous enemies come from within your own family. My name is Cassandra. I'm 29 years old, and I work as a pediatric nurse at Riverside Children's Hospital in Millfield, Oregon. I've always been the type of person who sees the good in people, maybe to a fault. I believe in giving second chances, in family loyalty, and in the idea that love can overcome most obstacles. But some people mistake kindness for weakness, and my story is about what happens when someone pushes a kind person too far. This whole nightmare began with what should have been one of the happiest times of my life. 2 years ago, I married the love of my life, Jonathan Brennan, after dating for 4 years. Jonathan is everything I could have asked for in a partner. He's patient, hardworking, and has this quiet strength that makes me feel safe no matter what's happening in the world. He works as an electrician for the city, and we've built a beautiful life together in our small two-bedroom house on Maple Street. When Jonathan proposed to me during a weekend camping trip at Crystal Lake, I knew I was marrying not just him, but his entire family. And honestly, I was excited about it. I'd grown up as an only child with parents who divorced when I was 12, so the idea of having a big, close-knit family felt like a dream come true. Jonathan has two siblings, his older sister Rachel, who's married to a man named Trevor, and his younger brother Austin, who serves in the military. The Brennan family seemed warm and welcoming from the outside, always gathering for Sunday dinners and holiday celebrations. But then there was Delilah Brennan, Jonathan's mother. From the very first time I met her, something felt off. She was polite enough when Jonathan was around, but there was this coldness in her eyes whenever she looked at me. It was subtle at first. Little comments about my clothes, my job, my background. She'd make remarks about how different Jonathan and I were, how she'd always imagined him with someone more established or from a better family. When I tried to talk to Jonathan about it, he'd brush it off, saying his mother was just protective and that she'd warm up to me eventually. Delilah worked part-time at a local insurance office, but she always seemed to have money problems. She'd constantly complain about bills, about how expensive everything was, about how she couldn't afford this or that. Yet somehow, she always had money for her weekly trips to the Riverside casino, which was about an hour drive from our town. Jonathan and his siblings knew about her gambling, but they'd convinced themselves it was just harmless fun, a way for her to socialize and blow off steam after their father had passed away 3 years earlier. What made this whole situation even more painful was the significance of the jewelry that Delilah eventually stole. The collection belonged to my grandmother, Evelyn Hartwell, who had passed away when I was 25. My grandmother was the most important person in my life growing up. After my parents' messy divorce, I spent every summer and most weekends at her house in the countryside. She taught me how to bake, how to garden, and most importantly, how to be strong and independent. My grandmother's jewelry collection was her pride and joy. She'd started collecting pieces in the 1950s, and over the decades, she'd acquired some truly beautiful and valuable items. There was a Victorian-era sapphire necklace that had belonged to her own grandmother, a pair of Art Deco diamond earrings she'd bought for herself when she got her first job as a secretary, and a stunning emerald bracelet that my grandfather had given her for their 25th wedding anniversary. But the most precious piece was a delicate gold locket with intricate engravings that contained tiny photos of my grandfather and my mother as a baby. When my grandmother passed away, she left the entire collection to me in her will. She'd specifically written that she wanted me to have these pieces because I was the only one in the family who truly appreciated their history and sentimental value. My cousins had always been more interested in the monetary value of things, but I cherished each piece for the memories it held. I kept the collection in a beautiful mahogany jewelry box that had also belonged to my grandmother, and it sat on the dresser in our bedroom.
The jewelry collection had been appraised at approximately $25,000, though honestly, its sentimental value was priceless to me. I rarely wore most of the pieces because they were so delicate and vintage, but I would take them out occasionally to clean them and remember my grandmother. Sometimes Jonathan would find me sitting at our dresser, holding the locket and looking at the tiny faded photographs inside. Looking back now, I realize there were warning signs that I should have paid attention to. Delilah had always been very interested in my grandmother's jewelry. During family gatherings, she'd often steer conversations toward my inheritance, asking detailed questions about individual pieces and their value. She'd make comments about how lucky I was to have inherited such beautiful things and how she wished she had family heirlooms to pass down to her own children. I thought she was just being friendly and showing interest in something that was important to me. I never imagined that she was actually cataloging every piece, mentally calculating their worth, and planning the theft that would eventually tear our family apart and reveal her true character to everyone who thought they knew Delilah Brennan. This is the story of how one woman's gambling addiction and sense of entitlement led her to betray her own family's trust, and how my brother-in-law's military training became the key to exposing the truth and delivering justice in a way none of us could have anticipated. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Let me tell you a bit more about myself so you understand why this betrayal hit me so hard and why I handled it the way I did. I've always been what people call the peacekeeper in every situation. Growing up in a broken home taught me to avoid conflict at all costs, to smooth over problems, and to give people the benefit of the doubt even when they probably didn't deserve it. Spoiler alert, it never did. They finally divorced when I was 12, and honestly, it was a relief. After the divorce, I split my time between two very different households. My father remarried quickly to a woman named Janet who made it clear that I was an inconvenience in her new perfect family. My mother, on the other hand, threw herself into her career as a real estate agent and was rarely home. The only constant in my life was my grandmother Evelyn, my mother's mother, who lived about 40 minutes away in the small town of Oak Ridge. Every Friday after school, my grandmother would pick me up in her old blue Buick, and I'd spend the weekend at her house. Those weekends saved my sanity. Grandmother Evelyn was everything my parents weren't: calm, patient, consistent, and genuinely interested in my thoughts and feelings. Her house was this beautiful Victorian-era home with a wraparound porch filled with antiques and family photographs that told the story of generations of strong women. It was during those weekends that I fell in love with my grandmother's jewelry collection. She would let me try on different pieces while she told me their stories. The sapphire necklace was worn by my great-great-grandmother to her wedding in 1923. The diamond earrings were my grandmother's first major purchase when she started working as a secretary in Portland back in 1954, a symbol of her independence in an era when women weren't supposed to be financially autonomous. Each piece had a story, a memory, a connection to the women who came before me. My grandmother taught me that jewelry wasn't just about beauty or value. It was about legacy, about carrying forward the strength and love of the women in our family. She would say, "Cassandra, these pieces have witnessed decades of joy, sorrow, love, and triumph. When you wear them someday, you'll carry all of that history with you." This background is important because it explains why I became a nurse. My grandmother's care and attention during my chaotic childhood showed me the power of genuine compassion.
I wanted to be someone who helped others the way she helped me. I graduated from Pacific Northwest University with my nursing degree and immediately knew I wanted to work with children. Kids who are sick or scared remind me of myself at that age, vulnerable and needing someone to be genuinely present for them. At Riverside Children's Hospital, I'm known as the nurse who stays late to read bedtime stories, who remembers every patient's favorite stuffed animal, and who can calm down the most frightened child. My colleagues often joke that I'm too nice for my own good, and they're probably right. I've covered extra shifts for colleagues who were probably lying about being sick. I've lent money to friends who never paid me back, and I've made excuses for people's bad behavior more times than I can count. This tendency to see the best in people is exactly what made me vulnerable to Delilah's manipulation. When I met Jonathan during a community health fair where the hospital had set up a booth, I was immediately drawn to his kindness and stability. He was volunteering to help set up electrical equipment for the event, and when our booth's power went out, he spent his entire Saturday afternoon fixing it without being asked and without expecting anything in return. Jonathan and I dated for 4 years before getting married. And during that time, I tried so hard to fit into his family. The Brennans were everything I'd never had. Loud, boisterous, always gathering for holidays and birthdays. Jonathan's father, Robert, had passed away from a heart attack 3 years before I met the family. But from the stories everyone told, he'd been the anchor that held everyone together. Without Robert's stabilizing presence, Delilah had become the family matriarch, and she ruled with a combination of guilt trips and emotional manipulation that I didn't recognize at the time. She had this way of making comments that sounded caring, but were actually designed to make you feel inadequate. "Oh, Cassandra, you look tired. Are you sure you're getting enough rest? You know, Jonathan needs someone who can keep up with him." Or, "I hope you're not working too many hours at that hospital. Jonathan's father always said a man needs a wife who puts family first." I internalized all of these comments and tried harder to prove myself worthy of being a Brennan. I volunteered to host holiday dinners, brought homemade meals when anyone was sick, and always made sure to ask Delilah about her life and interests. I genuinely wanted her to like me, and I thought if I was just patient and kind enough, she'd eventually accept me as part of the family. What I didn't understand then was that Delilah saw my kindness as weakness and my desire to please as an opportunity to take advantage. She was already struggling financially due to her gambling habit, and she'd probably been planning her theft from the moment she first saw my grandmother's jewelry collection during a family dinner where I'd worn the sapphire necklace. Looking back, I can see how perfectly I fit the profile of an ideal victim for someone like Delilah. I was isolated from my own family, desperate to belong to hers, and conditioned from childhood to avoid confrontation and keep the peace. I trusted her because she was my husband's mother, and I'd been raised to respect my elders and assume good intentions. But respect and trust, I learned, have to be earned, not given automatically based on family relationships or age. And sometimes the people who seem most harmless are actually the most dangerous because they know exactly how to exploit your best qualities against you. This is who I was when Delilah Brennan decided to steal from me, a woman who had spent her entire life trying to avoid conflict, who valued family above almost everything else, and who would have done anything to protect the peace in her marriage. She thought these qualities made me the perfect mark. She was wrong. Delilah Brennan was 58 years old when I first met her, and she had perfected the art of being two completely different people depending on who was watching. Around Jonathan and his siblings, she was the grieving widow who had sacrificed everything for her children, the devoted mother who only wanted what was best for her family. But when the audience changed, so did Delilah. The first time I witnessed this transformation was during Jonathan's birthday dinner at their family home on Elm Street. It was a modest 2-story house that Robert had bought in the 1980s, with a small front yard that Delilah never bothered to maintain,
and peeling paint that spoke to years of deferred maintenance. The inside was cluttered with knickknacks and furniture that had seen better days, but it was clean and had that lived-in feeling that comes from decades of family memories. During dinner, Delilah was the picture of maternal warmth. She fussed over Jonathan, made sure everyone had enough food, and told embarrassing stories from his childhood that made everyone laugh. But when Jonathan and Austin went outside to check on something in the garage, her entire demeanor shifted. The warm smile disappeared, replaced by a calculating look that made me uncomfortable. "So, Cassandra," she said, her voice taking on a different tone entirely, "Jonathan tells me you inherited quite a bit when your grandmother passed. That must be nice, having that kind of security at such a young age." The comment caught me off guard. I'd mentioned my grandmother's jewelry to Jonathan, but I hadn't realized he'd shared those details with his mother. "It's not really about the money. The pieces are meaningful because they belong to my grandmother." Delilah's laugh was sharp. "Of course, dear, but meaning doesn't pay bills, does it? It's smart that you have something valuable to fall back on. Not everyone is that fortunate." When Jonathan and Austin returned, Delilah immediately switched back to her motherly persona. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just been evaluated like a piece of merchandise. Over the following months, I began to notice this pattern more and more. Delilah had different masks for different situations, and I was never quite sure which version I was going to encounter. The real Delilah Brennan, I learned, was a woman who had been living beyond her means for years. After Robert's death, she'd received a modest life insurance payout and Social Security benefits, but instead of using the money wisely, she'd developed what started as a casual interest in gambling and had gradually become a serious addiction. It began innocently enough. A few months after Robert's funeral, Delilah's friend Martha had invited her to try the slot machines at Riverside Casino as a way to get out of the house and socialize. What started as a weekly social outing quickly escalated to 2 or 3 trips a week, then daily visits. She would drive the hour to the casino, often staying from afternoon until late at night, feeding 20s and 50s into the machines with the desperate hope that the next spin would solve all her problems.
Jonathan and his siblings knew about the gambling, but they'd convinced themselves it was harmless. "Mom needs something to keep her busy," Rachel would say. "It's better than sitting at home feeling sorry for herself." Austin, who was often deployed with his military unit, wasn't around enough to see the full extent of the problem. And Jonathan, sweet as he was, had always been blind to his mother's faults. But I began to see the signs that everyone else was ignoring or making excuses for. Delilah's house was falling apart because she couldn't afford basic maintenance. The roof leaked in 3 different places, creating brown stains on the ceiling that she covered with strategically placed pots during rainstorms. The furnace was old and inefficient, making the house uncomfortably cold in winter, but she couldn't afford to replace it. Her car, a 15-year-old sedan, was constantly breaking down, yet she somehow always found money for her casino trips. More troubling were the small lies that started to add up. Delilah would claim she couldn't afford to contribute to family birthday gifts, but then I'd see her posting photos on Facebook from expensive restaurants near the casino. She'd complain about not being able to pay her electric bill, but her purse was always full of casino players' club cards and comp vouchers. The most revealing incident happened about 6 months before the jewelry theft. Austin was home on leave, and the family had gathered for Sunday dinner. Delilah was in the kitchen preparing dessert when her phone rang. I happened to be nearby, helping clear dishes, when I overheard her conversation. "No, I understand," she was saying, her voice tense. "I know it's past due. I just need another week or 2. There was a pause. "Look, I have some valuable items I could sell if necessary. Antique jewelry, very high quality. It would more than cover what I owe." My blood ran cold. She wasn't talking about her own jewelry. Delilah owned nothing more valuable than a simple wedding band and a few department store pieces. She had to be talking about my grandmother's collection. When she hung up, she turned and saw me standing there. For just a moment, her mask slipped completely, and I saw pure desperation in her eyes. Then she forced a smile and said, "Oh, Cassandra, I didn't see you there. That was just someone trying to sell me insurance. You know how persistent these salespeople can be." I wanted to confront her about what I'd overheard, but my lifelong pattern of avoiding conflict kicked in. Instead, I convinced myself that I must have misunderstood, that surely she wouldn't be considering stealing from her own family. I told myself that even if Delilah was having financial problems, she would never betray Jonathan's trust or mine. This was my biggest mistake, underestimating what desperation could drive someone to do. Over the years, I'd learned pieces of Delilah's history that helped explain, though certainly not excuse, her behavior. She'd grown up in poverty in rural Idaho, the youngest of 6 children in a family that struggled to put food on the table. Her father had been an alcoholic who spent most of his paycheck at the local bar, leaving her mother to raise the children on whatever money was left. Delilah had married Robert when she was just 19, desperate to escape her family's dysfunction. Robert had been a good man, stable, hardworking, and devoted to his family, but he'd never been particularly ambitious or financially savvy. They'd lived paycheck to paycheck for most of their marriage, never quite getting ahead, but never falling seriously behind either. When Robert died suddenly, Delilah found herself truly alone for the first time in her adult life. She'd never learned to manage finances independently, never developed her own identity outside of being a wife and mother. The gambling, I realized later, wasn't just about money. It was about the excitement, the temporary escape from grief and fear, the illusion of control in a life that felt completely out of control. But understanding Delilah's motivations didn't make her actions any less devastating. She'd identified me as someone with resources she could access, and she'd spent months studying my habits, learning about my grandmother's jewelry, and planning her theft. She knew I trusted her because she was Jonathan's mother. She knew I would go to great lengths to avoid family conflict, and she knew that even if I suspected something, I probably wouldn't act on those suspicions immediately. What Delilah didn't know was that her youngest son, Austin, had inherited more than just his father's sense of honor and justice. Austin Brennan was a decorated member of Delta Force, trained in reconnaissance, investigation, and tactical operations. He'd spent years learning to identify threats, gather intelligence, and neutralize enemies who thought they were smarter than they actually were. And Austin was coming home on leave in 2 weeks. The breaking point for Delilah came in early March, about 3 weeks before Austin's scheduled leave. I didn't know it at the time, but she had just received a final notice from Riverside Casino's credit department. Her gambling debts had reached $18,000, and the casino was threatening legal action if she didn't pay within 30 days. On top of that, she owed $3,200 to her mortgage company, $1,800 to the electric company, and $950 to a payday loan company that charged interest rates that should have been illegal. The payday loan was particularly devastating because Delilah had fallen into the classic trap that these predatory lenders set. She'd borrowed $500 to cover a car repair, thinking she could pay it back quickly. But when the payment came due, she didn't have the money, so she'd rolled it over, paying fees and interest that quickly doubled the original amount. Each month, she was paying hundreds of dollars just in fees, without even touching the principal balance.
What made Delilah's situation even more desperate was that she'd exhausted every other option. She'd already taken cash advances on 3 different credit cards, maxing them all out. She'd pawned Robert's tools, his watch, and even her own wedding ring. She'd borrowed money from 2 different friends, lying about what she needed it for, and both relationships had ended when she failed to pay them back, as promised. The casino debt was the most terrifying because they weren't just threatening to take her to court, they were threatening to ban her from the only place where she felt like she could escape her problems. In Delilah's twisted logic, being banned from the casino would mean losing her only chance of winning enough money to solve her financial crisis. She needed to stay in their good graces long enough to hit a big jackpot that would fix everything. This is when Delilah's attention turned seriously to my grandmother's jewelry collection. She'd been thinking about it for months, but now it became an obsession. She knew from conversations with Jonathan that the collection was worth approximately $25,000, more than enough to pay off all her debts and give her a fresh start. In her mind, she wasn't really stealing. She was just temporarily borrowing against assets that would eventually belong to the family anyway when Jonathan and I had children. Delilah began researching local jewelry buyers and pawn shops, calling around to get quotes on antique pieces similar to what I owned. She learned that the Victorian sapphire necklace alone could bring $8,000 to $10,000 from the right buyer. The Art Deco diamond earrings were worth at least $6,000. The emerald bracelet could fetch $5,000 or more. Even the smaller pieces, the gold locket, a pearl brooch, several vintage rings, would bring hundreds or thousands of dollars each. More importantly, Delilah realized that my grandmother's jewelry collection was the perfect target because of its nature. Unlike cash or electronics, antique jewelry wasn't something I'd notice immediately. I rarely wore the pieces, keeping them safely stored in the mahogany jewelry box on my dresser. Delilah knew from family gatherings that I only took the collection out occasionally to clean the pieces or to show someone a particular item when telling stories about my grandmother. This gave Delilah what she thought was the perfect opportunity. If she could take the jewelry when I wouldn't notice for several weeks or even months, she could sell the pieces, pay off her debts, and then claim the jewelry had been stolen by burglars. She might even be able to collect insurance money on top of everything else, since I'd mentioned having the collection appraised and insured after inheriting it. But Delilah needed access to our house when neither Jonathan nor I would be home for several hours. She also needed to be sure that we wouldn't suspect her involvement. This required careful planning and observation of our routines. Delilah began finding excuses to visit our house more frequently, always when she could study our habits and schedules. She'd drop by with homemade cookies, claiming she'd made too many and didn't want them to go to waste. She'd offer to water our plants when we went out of town for a weekend. She'd volunteer to let repair technicians into the house when we were both working, positioning herself as the helpful mother-in-law who was always willing to lend a hand. During these visits, Delilah carefully observed our daily routines. She learned that I worked 3 12-hour shifts at the hospital each week, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, usually from 7 a.m. to 7:30 p.m. Jonathan typically worked Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., but he often stayed late on Thursdays to finish projects before the weekend. This meant that Thursday afternoons and early evenings were when our house was most likely to be empty for extended periods. Delilah also noted that our neighbors weren't particularly observant. Mrs. Patterson on our left was elderly and rarely looked out her windows. The young couple on our right both worked long hours and were hardly ever home themselves. The houses across the street were far enough away that someone could come and go from our driveway without being noticed, especially if they parked behind our house near the back entrance. Most crucially, Delilah discovered where we kept our spare key. Like many couples, Jonathan and I had hidden a key outside for emergencies, tucked inside a fake rock near our back porch. Delilah had seen Jonathan retrieve it once when I'd accidentally locked us out after a family barbecue, and she'd carefully noted its location. The final piece of Delilah's plan involved creating an alibi for herself. She knew that if the jewelry went missing, she'd be an obvious suspect given her financial problems and her familiarity with our house. So, she began establishing a pattern of being at the casino during the times she planned to commit the theft. She made sure the casino security cameras caught her there on several Thursday afternoons, building a record that would supposedly prove she couldn't have been at our house. What Delilah didn't realize is that modern casino security systems are far more sophisticated than she imagined. They don't just record when you enter and leave, they track your movements throughout the building, monitor your gambling activity, and even note when you take breaks. The gaps in her presence would be clearly documented,
but she was too focused on her amateur understanding of alibis to consider these details.
By late March, Delilah had convinced herself that her plan was foolproof. She would wait for a Thursday when both Jonathan and I were definitely working, use the spare key to enter our house, take the jewelry collection, and immediately drive to Portland, where she'd already identified a jewelry buyer who dealt in estate pieces and didn't ask too many questions. She could complete the entire operation in less than 4 hours and be back at the casino by evening, creating the appearance that she'd been gambling all day. The only thing Delilah hadn't accounted for was Austin's military leave schedule. She knew he was coming home soon, but she didn't know the exact dates, and she certainly didn't understand how his Delta Force training had taught him to notice details that ordinary people missed. Austin had spent years learning to identify when something was wrong, to piece together evidence that others overlooked, and to pursue the truth no matter how uncomfortable it made people. In Delilah's mind, Austin was still the little boy she'd raised, the son who respected his mother and wouldn't question her word against an outsider's accusations. She had no idea that Austin had grown into a man who valued honor and justice above family loyalty, and who had the skills to investigate and expose the truth even when it came from within his own family. The stage was set for the theft that would finally reveal Delilah's true character to everyone who had been making excuses for her behavior. But it was also set for a confrontation that would be far more devastating than Delilah could have possibly imagined. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Tuesday morning in mid-April. I was getting ready for my shift at the hospital when I noticed that the mahogany jewelry box on my dresser was sitting in a slightly different position than usual. It was such a small detail that most people would have dismissed it, but I'd grown up in a chaotic household where I'd learned to notice when things were out of place. The jewelry box normally sat with its front corner aligned with the edge of a small lace doily that my grandmother had crocheted. Now it was about an inch to the left, and the doily was slightly wrinkled as if someone had moved the box and then tried to put it back exactly where it had been. I opened the box to check the contents, and everything appeared to be there, but something felt different about the way the pieces were arranged. I mentioned it to Jonathan over dinner that night, but he suggested that maybe I'd moved it myself while cleaning and just forgot. "You've been working a lot of extra shifts lately," he said gently. "Maybe you're just tired." It was a reasonable explanation, and I wanted to believe it, so I convinced myself that he was right. The second incident happened the following week. I came home from work on Thursday evening to find muddy footprints on our back porch that definitely weren't from Jonathan's work boots or my nursing shoes. The prints were smaller than Jonathan's, but larger than mine, and they had a distinctive tread pattern that I didn't recognize. More concerning was that the prints led directly to our back door and then disappeared, as if someone had wiped their feet before entering the house. When I asked Jonathan about it, he said he'd had a coworker drop off some electrical supplies earlier in the day and that the guy had probably used the back entrance because it was closer to his truck. It seemed plausible, but something about the explanation didn't sit right with me. Jonathan usually mentioned when people were coming by the house, and I couldn't remember him saying anything about expecting a delivery. That same week, I started noticing phone calls to our landline that would hang up as soon as I answered. This happened 3 times over the course of 5 days, always during times when Jonathan was at work and I was home alone. When I mentioned it to Jonathan, he suggested it was probably telemarketers with automated calling systems that sometimes disconnected when a real person answered. But the timing seemed too coincidental. The calls always came during specific windows when I would normally be home alone, as if someone was checking to see if anyone was there. I started feeling like I was being watched or monitored, though I couldn't explain why. The most unsettling incident happened on a Saturday when Jonathan and I were having lunch with his family at Delilah's house. I'd worn my grandmother's pearl brooch, a delicate piece from the 1940s that had always been one of my favorites. During the meal, Delilah complimented the brooch and asked if she could take a closer look at it. It's so intricate, she said, holding the piece up to the light and examining it from every angle. The craftsmanship on these old pieces is just incredible. You don't see work like this anymore. She spent several minutes studying the brooch, asking detailed questions about its history and estimated value. I bet this could bring quite a bit at auction, couldn't it? Her intense interest made me uncomfortable, but I tried to be polite and answer her questions. When I asked for the brooch back so I could pin it to my blouse again, Delilah held on to it for another moment, her fingers tracing the delicate pearls and gold setting. "I just can't get over how beautiful this is," she said. "You're so lucky to have inherited such wonderful pieces." Later that afternoon, Rachel pulled me aside privately. She said, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but have you noticed anything different about Mom lately? She's been asking a lot of questions about valuable things people own, jewelry, electronics, family heirlooms. It's not like her to be so focused on money and possessions."
Rachel's observation confirmed that I wasn't imagining Delilah's unusual behavior. But when I tried to discuss it with Jonathan later, he defended his mother as he always did. "She's probably just feeling insecure about her own finances," he said. "Dad always handled the money, and now she's trying to figure everything out on her own. Maybe she's just curious about how other people manage their valuable possessions." Around the same time, I began receiving strange text messages that seemed designed to gather information about my schedule. Delilah would text questions like, "Are you working late tomorrow?" or "Will you and Jonathan be home this weekend?" When I asked why she needed to know, she'd always have a reasonable explanation. She wanted to drop off leftovers, or she was thinking about stopping by to borrow something, or she'd found a good deal on something at the store and wanted to know if we were interested. But the questions felt too frequent and too specific. Delilah had never been particularly interested in our daily schedules before, and she'd certainly never been the type to text regularly. The sudden change in her communication patterns was another red flag that I couldn't quite ignore, even though I kept trying to rationalize it. One evening in late April, I decided to test my suspicions. I told Delilah via text that Jonathan and I would be out of town for the weekend visiting my cousin in Seattle. This was completely false. We had no plans to travel anywhere. Then I spent Saturday afternoon strategically positioned where I could see anyone approaching our house. Sure enough, around 2 p.m., I saw Delilah's sedan drive slowly past our house. She didn't stop, but she clearly turned her head to look at our driveway and windows, as if checking to see if anyone was home. About an hour later, she drove by again, this time even more slowly. I felt sick to my stomach as the reality of what was happening began to sink in. That Sunday, Delilah called Jonathan to ask how our trip to Seattle had gone. When he told her we hadn't gone anywhere, she seemed flustered and claimed she must have misunderstood my text message. But I knew exactly what had happened. She'd been planning to break into our house while we were supposedly out of town, and my lie had disrupted her plans. The final warning sign came when I started paying closer attention to our home security. Jonathan had installed a basic alarm system a few years earlier, but it was an older model that we rarely used because we lived in such a safe neighborhood. When I checked the system's log, I discovered that it had been disarmed and rearmed several times during hours when neither Jonathan nor I had been home. The timestamps corresponded exactly with days when I'd noticed other suspicious signs: the moved jewelry box, the muddy footprints, the hang-up phone calls. Someone had been entering our house regularly, someone who knew our spare key and our alarm code. The only people besides Jonathan and me who knew both pieces of information were immediate family members. When I confronted Jonathan with all of this evidence, he finally began to take my concerns seriously. "Are you saying you think someone in my family has been breaking into our house?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief and pain. "I'm saying someone has definitely been in our house when we weren't here. And whoever it is knows our routines, our security system, and where we keep our spare key. They've been watching us, Jonathan. They've been planning something."
Jonathan wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation, but even he couldn't deny the pattern of evidence I'd assembled. We decided to change our alarm code and move the spare key to a different location. We also agreed that I would start taking photos of my jewelry box arrangement so we could tell if anyone had been going through it. But even as we took these precautions, I had a terrible feeling that we were too late. Someone had been preparing for something specific, and all the planning and surveillance suggested that whatever they were planning was about to happen soon. I just had no idea that Delilah was only days away from making her move, or that Austin's unexpected early arrival would turn her carefully planned theft into the most catastrophic mistake of her life. Thursday, May 2nd, was supposed to be the day Delilah executed her plan. She'd been monitoring our schedules for weeks and knew that I was working a double shift at the hospital, covering for a colleague who had called in sick with the flu. Jonathan had mentioned at Sunday dinner that he had a major electrical project at the new municipal building that would likely keep him working until at least 8 p.m. It was the perfect opportunity she'd been waiting for. But what Delilah didn't know was that Austin had received an unexpected change to his leave schedule. His unit had completed their training mission ahead of schedule, and instead of arriving home on Saturday as originally planned, he was driving up from Fort Bragg on Thursday morning. He decided to surprise the family by showing up unannounced, something he'd done many times over the years. That Thursday morning, I left for work at 6:30 a.m. for what I thought would be a routine day. I'd been feeling increasingly anxious about the security issues at our house, but Jonathan had convinced me that we were probably overreacting. We'd changed the alarm code and moved the spare key, and nothing suspicious had happened for over a week. Maybe we thought whoever had been watching us had given up or moved on to easier targets.
Meanwhile, Delilah spent the morning at Riverside Casino establishing her alibi just as she'd planned. She made sure to use her player's card at multiple slot machines, chatted with dealers she knew by name, and even had lunch at the casino restaurant where the waitstaff would remember seeing her. Everything was going according to her carefully rehearsed schedule. Around 1 p.m., Delilah left the casino and drove toward our neighborhood. She'd timed the drive multiple times and knew it took exactly 53 minutes from the casino parking lot to our street. This gave her a 4-hour window to complete the theft and return to the casino before anyone would expect to see her there for her usual evening gambling session. But as Delilah turned onto Maple Street, she saw something that made her blood run cold: an unfamiliar pickup truck with North Carolina military base license plates parked in her own driveway. Austin was home early, and he was at her house, not ours. She quickly drove past without stopping, her mind racing as she tried to figure out what this meant for her plan. Austin had indeed arrived that morning, driving straight to his mother's house on Elm Street, expecting to surprise her. When no one answered the door, he'd used his own key to enter, planning to wait inside until she returned. But what Austin found inside the house immediately triggered his professional instincts that something was very wrong. The first thing Austin noticed was that his mother's house was in terrible condition. The roof leak he remembered from his last visit had gotten much worse, with multiple buckets placed around the living room to catch dripping water. The furniture was covered with towels and plastic sheets to protect it from the leaks, giving the house a desperate, neglected appearance that was completely unlike the proud home his father had maintained. More concerning was what was missing. Austin realized that many of his father's possessions had disappeared. Tools from the garage, his watch collection, even some of the electronics they'd owned for years. When Austin checked his mother's bedroom, he found pawn shop receipts scattered on her dresser, documenting the sale of items that should never have been sold. But the most alarming discovery came when Austin checked his mother's computer, looking for clues about where she might be. Delilah had never been good with technology and hadn't realized that her internet browser was saving a detailed history of every website she visited. Austin found extensive research into local jewelry buyers, pawn shops, and estate sale companies. There were multiple searches for terms like antique jewelry appraisal, selling inherited jewelry, and cash for gold, Portland, Oregon. Even more damning were the specific searches related to our house and schedules. Delilah had been using online resources to research Jonathan's employer, looking up the municipal building project that would keep him working late. She'd even searched for information about my hospital's shift schedules and which days I typically worked doubles. Austin's Delta Force training had taught him to piece together intelligence from seemingly unrelated information, and the picture that emerged was crystal clear. His mother was planning to steal valuable jewelry from Jonathan and me, and based on the timing of her research, she was planning to do it very soon. Around 2:30 p.m., Austin heard a car pull into the driveway. He quickly closed the computer and positioned himself where he could observe his mother without being seen immediately. When Delilah entered the house, her first words confirmed everything Austin had suspected. "Damn it," she muttered to herself, clearly agitated. "He's supposed to be gone until Saturday. This ruins everything." She threw her purse on the kitchen counter and began pacing frantically, pulling out her cell phone to check the time repeatedly. Austin watched as his mother went into her bedroom and emerged with a small toolkit and a flashlight, tools that would be perfect for a breaking and entering operation. She also grabbed a large canvas shopping bag, the kind that would be ideal for transporting stolen items without attracting attention. But then Delilah made the mistake that would ultimately destroy her. Instead of abandoning her plan, she decided to proceed anyway. She convinced herself that Austin would probably stay at the house all afternoon, catching up on rest after his long drive, and that she could still complete the theft without anyone noticing. Her gambling addiction had so distorted her thinking that she couldn't bear to pass up this opportunity, even with the increased risk. Austin followed his mother at a distance as she drove toward our neighborhood. He stayed far enough back that she wouldn't notice his truck, but close enough to observe her actions. When Delilah parked 2 blocks away from our house and began walking through the neighborhood on foot, Austin knew exactly what was happening. He watched as my mother approached our house from the backyard, avoiding the front entrance where neighbors might see her. She spent several minutes searching around our back porch, clearly looking for something. Austin realized she was looking for a spare key, and when she finally found it hidden under a decorative garden stone, he had all the evidence he needed of premeditation. But instead of confronting his mother immediately or calling the police, Austin made a strategic decision that would prove to be devastating for Delilah. He decided to let her complete the crime while documenting everything she did. His military training had taught him to catch someone in the act provided much stronger evidence than stopping them before they actually committed the crime. Austin positioned himself where he could observe the entire operation while remaining hidden. He used his phone to record video evidence of his mother entering our house with the stolen key. He noted the exact time and her movements. He documented how long she remained inside the house and what she was carrying when she emerged. What Austin saw next made him physically sick. His mother came out of our house carrying my grandmother's mahogany jewelry box, making no attempt to disguise what she was stealing. She walked quickly back to her car, placed the box in her trunk, and drove away as if nothing had happened. For Austin, this wasn't just theft. It was a betrayal of everything his father had taught him about honor, integrity, and protecting family. Robert Brennan had raised his sons to believe that a man's character was defined by how he treated people who trusted him, and watching his mother steal from his brother's wife was the most devastating thing Austin had ever witnessed. As Delilah drove back toward the casino to continue building her alibi, she had no idea that her youngest son had recorded everything she'd done. She didn't know that Austin had photographed the evidence on her computer, documented the missing items from her house, and captured video of her breaking into our home. Most importantly, she didn't know that Austin was now driving to the hospital to find me, carrying evidence that would destroy her life and expose her crimes to the entire family. Delilah thought she'd pulled off the perfect crime, but she'd actually just handed her son everything he needed to bring her down. I was in the middle of administering medication to a 7-year-old patient when our unit secretary appeared at the door looking flustered. "Cassandra, there's a man here who says he's your brother-in-law. He's in military uniform and he says it's urgent that he speak with you immediately." My heart immediately jumped to the worst possible conclusions. Austin showing up at my workplace unannounced could only mean something terrible had happened. Had there been an accident? Was Jonathan hurt? Had something happened to Delilah or Rachel? I quickly finished with my patient and asked my supervisor if I could take a few minutes to speak with him. Austin was waiting in the small conference room we used for family meetings, still wearing his combat fatigues from the drive up from North Carolina. His jaw was set in a way I'd never seen before, and his eyes held an expression that was part anger, part disgust, and part something else I couldn't quite identify. This wasn't the relaxed, joking Austin I knew from family gatherings. This was a soldier who had discovered an enemy. "Austin, what's wrong?" I asked immediately. "Is everyone okay? Is Jonathan hurt?" "Jonathan's fine," Austin said, his voice tight and controlled. "But I need to show you something, and you're not going to like it." He pulled out his phone and set it on the table between us. "Before I show you this, I need you to know that I've already called Jonathan. He's on his way here." The dread in my stomach intensified. "Austin, you're scaring me. What happened?" "My mother stole your jewelry," he said flatly. "All of it. She broke into your house this afternoon while you were working and took everything from that wooden box on your dresser." For a moment, the words didn't compute. I stared at Austin, waiting for him to tell me this was some kind of mistake or misunderstanding. "That's impossible," I said finally. "Delilah wouldn't... she's your mother. She wouldn't steal from family." Austin's expression didn't change. He said, "Watch this." He pressed play on his phone. The video started with a timestamp showing 3:47 p.m. that afternoon. I could see our backyard clearly, and there was a figure moving around our back porch. As the person came closer to the camera angle, my blood turned to ice. It was unmistakably Delilah, wearing the same blue cardigan she'd worn to church last Sunday. She was searching around our porch methodically, clearly looking for something specific. "She's looking for your spare key," Austin explained, his voice completely emotionless. "Keep watching." The video continued as Delilah found the key under the garden stone where we'd hidden it. She looked around carefully to make sure no one was watching, then inserted the key into our back door and disappeared inside our house. "How did you—" I started to ask, but Austin held up his hand. "I got home early from my deployment. When I went to Mom's house, I found evidence that she's been planning this for weeks. Her computer has detailed searches about selling your jewelry, Jonathan's work schedule, your hospital shifts. She's been researching everything about your routines." The video jumped forward to 4:23 p.m. Delilah emerged from our house carrying my grandmother's mahogany jewelry box, the same box that had sat on our dresser for 2 years. She wasn't even trying to hide it, holding it openly as she walked quickly back toward the street. I felt like I was going to be sick. The jewelry box that contained every precious piece my grandmother had left me, the tangible connections to the most important person from my childhood, was disappearing into the trunk of Delilah's car. But more than that, I was watching the complete destruction of my trust in the family I'd tried so hard to become part of. "There's more," Austin said grimly. He showed me photographs he'd taken inside Delilah's house, pawn shop receipts documenting the sale of Robert's tools, his watches, even his wedding ring. He's been systematically selling everything Dad left behind to pay for her gambling debts. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Browser history screenshots showing Delilah's research into jewelry buyers in Portland, financial documents revealing debts to the casino, payday loan companies, and multiple credit card companies. And, most damning of all, handwritten notes in Delilah's own handwriting listing each piece of my jewelry with estimated values next to them.
She's been planning this for months, Austin continued. She knows exactly what each piece is worth. Look at this. He showed me a note that made my stomach turn. In Delilah's handwriting, it said, Victorian sapphire necklace, $8,000 to $10,000. Art Deco diamond earrings, $6,000. Emerald bracelet, $5,000. Gold locket, $800. Should cover casino debt plus mortgage. Seeing my grandmother's precious jewelry reduced to a list of dollar amounts was devastating enough, but what made it worse was the casual way Delilah had calculated exactly how much she could get for destroying my connection to my family history. She wasn't stealing from desperation in a moment of weakness. This was cold, calculated planning. Jonathan arrived at the hospital 20 minutes later, his face pale and his hands shaking. Austin showed him the same evidence he'd shown me, and I watched my husband's expression change from disbelief to horror to rage. "That's our house," Jonathan said, staring at the video. "That's Mom breaking into our house." His voice cracked on the last word. How could she do this? How could she steal from Cassandra? "It gets worse," Austin said. He pulled up the financial documents on his phone. "She owes over $20,000 to various creditors. She's been using the casino credit line, taking payday loans, maxing out credit cards. She's been living completely beyond her means for months." Jonathan buried his face in his hands. "Dad would be horrified. He worked so hard to pay off that house, to leave Mom financially secure. How did it get this bad?" "Gambling addiction," Austin said simply. "She's been spending everything at Riverside Casino, and when she ran out of her own money, she started planning to steal from us." The three of us sat in stunned silence for several minutes, processing the magnitude of what had happened. This wasn't just theft. It was the complete betrayal of everything we thought we knew about Delilah. The woman we'd trusted, the mother and mother-in-law we'd included in our lives and our plans, had been systematically planning to rob us. "We have to call the police," I said finally. "This is theft, breaking and entering, probably multiple felonies." Jonathan looked stricken. "Cassandra, I know she's done something terrible, but she's still my mother. Maybe we can handle this within the family. Maybe we can get her help and get your jewelry back without involving the law." Austin's response was immediate and firm. "No, absolutely not." His military training was evident in his tone. "She committed multiple crimes. She violated your trust, your security, your home. If we don't report this, we're enabling her to do it again to someone else." "But she's family," Jonathan protested weakly. "Family doesn't steal from family. Family doesn't spend months planning to rob the people who trusted them. She stopped being family the moment she broke into your house." I looked at both brothers, these two men I loved who were being torn apart by their mother's actions. "We're calling the police," I said firmly. "Not just because of the jewelry, but because this behavior has to have consequences. If we cover this up, we're telling her that she can get away with anything as long as she's sorry afterward." Austin nodded approvingly. "Dad raised us to do the right thing, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Calling the police is the right thing." As Austin dialed 911, I realized this moment was changing all of us forever. Delilah's theft hadn't just cost me my grandmother's jewelry. It had destroyed the illusion of family unity that we'd all been trying to maintain. But maybe, I thought, it was better to know the truth about who people really were than to keep living a lie. The police arrived at Riverside Casino at 6:45 p.m., just as Delilah was settling in for her evening gambling session. She'd returned from the theft feeling confident that her plan had worked perfectly. The jewelry was already sold to a buyer in Portland, netting her $19,400 in cash, enough to pay off her most pressing debts and buy herself some breathing room. She had no idea that her entire world was about to collapse.
Detective Maria Santos and Officer Kyle Richardson found Delilah at her usual slot machine, a double diamond game near the back of the casino floor. She was feeding $20 bills into the machine with the mechanical rhythm of someone who'd done this thousands of times before. When Detective Santos approached and showed her badge, Delilah's first reaction wasn't guilt or fear. It was annoyance. "Is there some kind of problem, officer?" Delilah asked, not even pausing her gambling. "I'm not doing anything wrong. I have every right to be here." "Mrs. Brennan, we need you to come with us to answer some questions about a theft that occurred this afternoon." Delilah's hand froze on the slot machine handle. For just a moment, her mask slipped and I could see panic flash across her features. But then she recovered, putting on an expression of confused innocence that she'd probably been practicing for months. "A theft? I don't know anything about any theft. I've been here all day. You can ask anyone. The staff knows me." She gestured toward a cocktail waitress who was passing by. "Linda, tell these officers I've been here since this morning." Linda looked uncomfortable, but nodded. "She's been here on and off today, yes, but Mrs. Brennan, you did leave for a few hours this afternoon. I remember because you asked me to hold your lucky machine." Delilah's face flushed red. "Well, yes, I went to get lunch. Is that a crime?"
Meanwhile, Austin, Jonathan, and I were at the police station providing our statements and evidence. Austin had brought his laptop with all the screenshots from Delilah's computer, his phone with the video footage, and printed copies of the financial documents he'd found. The evidence was so comprehensive that Detective Santos later told us it was one of the most well-documented theft cases she'd ever seen. When Delilah arrived at the police station in handcuffs, she was still maintaining her innocent act. She demanded to know what she was being accused of and insisted that there had to be some mistake. But when Detective Santos laid out the evidence, the video footage, the computer searches, the handwritten notes with my jewelry's estimated values, Delilah's strategy shifted completely. "That's not what it looks like," she said, her voice taking on a wheedling, manipulative tone that I'd never heard from her before. "Yes, I went to their house, but I wasn't stealing. I was borrowing the jewelry to have it cleaned as a surprise for Cassandra. I know how much those pieces mean to her." Austin leaned forward in his chair. "Then why did you research jewelry buyers for 3 weeks beforehand? Why did you write down the estimated sale values of each piece?" Delilah's eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal. I was getting them appraised. I wanted to make sure they were properly insured. Cassandra deserves to know what they're worth." "Mrs. Brennan," Detective Santos interrupted, "we've already spoken to the jewelry buyer in Portland. He's confirmed that you sold him multiple antique pieces this afternoon for cash. He still has the items in his possession." The room went completely silent. Delilah stared at the detective as if she couldn't quite process what she'd heard. Then, slowly, her entire demeanor began to change. The mask of innocence fell away, replaced by something much uglier. "Fine," she said, her voice bitter and cold. "Yes, I took the jewelry. Yes, I sold it. But you people don't understand what I've been going through. You don't understand the pressure I've been under since Robert died." She turned to look directly at me, and the hatred in her eyes was shocking. "You have no idea what it's like to lose everything, to watch your whole life fall apart while everyone around you just expects you to keep going like nothing happened. I needed that money, Cassandra. I needed it more than you needed some old jewelry sitting in a box collecting dust." Austin looked like he'd been slapped. "Mom, how can you say that? That jewelry belonged to Cassandra's grandmother. It's irreplaceable." "Irreplaceable?" Delilah laughed bitterly. "It's just things, Jonathan, just expensive things that she inherited because she got lucky. Meanwhile, I'm drowning in debt, losing the house your father worked his whole life to pay for, and none of you care enough to help." "We didn't know you were in financial trouble. You never asked for help." "I shouldn't have to ask," Delilah snapped. "Families should look out for each other. But instead, I watch you two living comfortably while I can't even afford to fix my roof. You flaunt expensive jewelry and nice cars while your own mother is struggling to survive."
Austin's voice was deadly quiet when he spoke. So your solution was to become a thief. Delilah's attention turned to Austin, and her expression became even more vicious. Don't you dare judge me, Austin. You have no idea what real life is like. You get to play soldier and travel the world while the rest of us deal with actual problems. This is your fault, too. If you'd been here instead of off playing war games, maybe you could have helped your mother instead of spying on her like some kind of secret agent. I was deployed serving my country, Austin replied evenly. But even if I'd been here every day, that wouldn't have given you the right to steal from my brother's wife. Delilah turned back to me, her face twisted with resentment. You want to know the truth, Cassandra? I never liked you. From the first day Jonathan brought you home, I knew you were wrong for this family. You're too soft, too privileged, too used to getting your way. You act like you're so sweet and innocent, but you're just a gold digger who got lucky when your grandmother died. The words hit me like physical blows. This was the woman I'd spent 2 years trying to please, trying to win over, trying to accept as family, and she'd been harboring this level of hatred for me the entire time. That's enough, Jonathan said, standing up abruptly. Don't you dare talk about my wife that way. Your wife? She's not family. She's an outsider who came in and turned you against your own mother. Before she came along, you cared about family. Now look at you. You're sitting here helping the police destroy me. Detective Santos intervened before the confrontation could escalate further. Mrs. Brennan, you're being charged with burglary in the first degree, theft in the first degree, and criminal trespass. You have the right to remain silent. As the detective read Delilah her rights, she continued to glare at me with pure malice. You think you've won. You think destroying me will make you happy, but this family will never forgive you for what you've done here today. You've turned my sons against their own mother. Austin stood up and faced his mother directly. No, Mom, you did this to yourself. You made the choice to steal. You made the choice to betray the people who trusted you, and you made the choice to show us who you really are. I'm still your mother, Delilah said desperately, as if that fact alone should absolve her of everything. A mother protects her family, Austin replied. A mother doesn't prey on them. You stopped being my mother the moment you decided to steal from the people I love. As they led Delilah away in handcuffs, she was still ranting about how we'd all betrayed her, how we'd never understand her desperation, how she was the real victim in this situation. Even facing criminal charges, even caught with overwhelming evidence, she couldn't accept responsibility for what she'd done. Jonathan sat in stunned silence for several minutes after she was gone. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I don't know who that woman was, but she wasn't the mother who raised me. The news of Delilah's arrest spread through the Brennan family and our social circle like wildfire, and the reactions revealed exactly where everyone's loyalties lay. Within hours of Delilah being booked into the county jail, my phone started ringing with calls that would forever change how I viewed the people in our lives. The first call came from Rachel at 9:30 p.m. that same night. Jonathan answered, and I could hear her voice through the phone, high-pitched, frantic, and accusatory. She was demanding to know how we could have done this to their mother, as if Delilah's crimes were somehow our fault for reporting them. Jonathan, how could you let them arrest Mom? She's grieving, she's confused, she made a mistake. But calling the police? Having your own mother arrested? Dad would be ashamed of you. Jonathan's face went pale at the mention of his father, but his voice remained steady. Rachel, she didn't make a mistake. She planned this for months. She broke into our house and stole Cassandra's jewelry. Austin has video evidence of everything. Austin should have minded his own business, Rachel snapped. And Cassandra should have been more understanding. It's just jewelry, Jonathan. Mom needed help. And instead of supporting her, you destroyed her life. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Rachel alternating between
begging Jonathan to drop the charges and attacking me for being vindictive and cruel. She claimed that a real daughter-in-law would have found a way to handle this privately without involving law enforcement. According to Rachel, I was tearing the family apart over material possessions that didn't really matter. Trevor, Rachel's husband, called the next morning with a different approach. He tried to position himself as the reasonable mediator who could help us all work this out. "Look, I understand you're upset," Trevor said when I answered. "What Delilah did was wrong, absolutely. But she's family, and family finds ways to forgive and move forward." Trevor suggested that we could probably get the jewelry back if we agreed to drop the charges, and that maybe we could all chip in to get Delilah some counseling for her gambling problem. Think about the big picture, Cassandra. Do you really want to be known as the daughter-in-law who sent her husband's mother to prison? How's that going to look to everyone? What struck me most about Trevor's call was how he kept emphasizing appearances and what other people would think, rather than addressing the fundamental violation of trust that had occurred. He seemed more concerned about the family's reputation than about the fact that Delilah had committed multiple felonies. But the most shocking call came from Delilah's sister, Margaret, who lived about 3 hours away in Salem. Margaret had always seemed like a reasonable, sensible woman during the few times we'd met at family gatherings, but her response to Delilah's arrest revealed a twisted sense of family loyalty that prioritized blood relations over basic morality. "Cassandra, dear, I know you're young and maybe you don't understand how families work yet, but we don't send each other to jail over misunderstandings." "It wasn't a misunderstanding," I replied firmly. "Delilah broke into our house and stole jewelry worth $25,000. She planned it for months." "Well, maybe if you'd been more generous with the family, she wouldn't have felt like she needed to take such drastic action. I mean, you inherited all that jewelry, and what do you do with it? You keep it locked up in a box while your mother-in-law struggles to pay her bills? Maybe this is God's way of teaching you about sharing." The victim blaming was so outrageous that I actually laughed. "Are you seriously suggesting that I deserved to be robbed because I didn't voluntarily give away my grandmother's jewelry?" "I'm suggesting that family takes care of family, and sometimes that means making sacrifices. Delilah raised 2 wonderful sons, and now she's suffering because her daughter-in-law cares more about old jewelry than about helping the woman who gave her the husband she loves." Even some of our friends and neighbors had troubling reactions. Mrs. Patterson, our elderly neighbor, stopped by 2 days after the arrest with a casserole and what she probably thought was helpful advice. "I heard about your troubles, dear. Of course, I don't know all the details, but I do know that family problems should be handled within the family. My generation understood that you don't air your dirty laundry in public, and you certainly don't involve the authorities unless someone's life is in danger." When I explained that Delilah had committed multiple felonies, Mrs. Patterson waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, laws and technicalities. The important thing is keeping the family together. Maybe if you'd paid more attention to Delilah's struggles, instead of focusing so much on your career, this whole situation could have been avoided."
The consistent theme in all these conversations was the expectation that I should have somehow prevented Delilah's crimes by being more giving, more understanding, more willing to sacrifice my own possessions and security for her benefit. According to this twisted logic, the victim of a crime was responsible for preventing it by anticipating the criminal's needs and meeting them preemptively. But not everyone reacted this way. Jonathan's cousin Peter, who lived in Portland, called to offer his complete support. "I've been worried about Aunt Delilah's gambling for years," he said. "My mom mentioned that she'd been acting strangely at family gatherings, asking weird questions about people's valuable possessions. What she did to you was inexcusable, and anyone who says otherwise is part of the problem." Peter also revealed information that put Delilah's behavior in a broader context. She tried to borrow money from my parents last year, he said. When they said no, she hinted that they had valuable antiques she could help them sell. My mom got really uncomfortable and stopped inviting her over. We should have said something, but we didn't want to cause family drama. My own parents, despite our complicated relationship, were unequivocally supportive when I called to tell them what had happened. My mother, who had met Delilah only a few times, wasn't surprised by the news. I never trusted that woman, she said bluntly. She was always asking too many questions about your inheritance and making comments about how lucky you were. I should have warned you to be careful around her. My father's reaction was even more direct. She's a criminal, Cassandra. Criminals belong in jail. Anyone who tells you otherwise is either naive or they're enablers who would probably do the same thing if they thought they could get away with it. The most meaningful support came from my colleagues at the hospital. When word spread about what had happened, I was overwhelmed by messages from nurses, doctors, and other staff members offering their encouragement and sharing their own stories about family members who had betrayed their trust. Dr. Patricia Holbrook, the head of our pediatric unit, pulled me aside during my next shift. "I want you to know that what happened to you could happen to anyone," she said. "Family members who commit crimes count on their victims being too embarrassed or too loyal to report them. By pressing charges, you're not just protecting yourself, you're protecting everyone else she might have targeted next." Sarah Martinez, one of the other nurses, had dealt with a similar situation when her brother stole her identity to get credit cards. The people who tell you to handle it within the family don't understand that some family members are predators. They use family loyalty as a weapon to get away with crimes they would never commit against strangers. Austin became our strongest defender within the Brennan family. When relatives called him to pressure him into talking us out of pressing charges, he shut them down immediately. Mom committed felonies. If she'd broken into a stranger's house and stolen their property, none of you would be making excuses for her. The fact that she's family makes it worse, not better, because she violated people who trusted her. Jonathan struggled more with the divided loyalties, but ultimately stood firm in supporting me and the decision to prosecute. When his Aunt Margaret called him directly to demand that he control his wife and drop the charges, Jonathan's response surprised even me. "Aunt Margaret," he said, his voice shaking with anger, "my wife was the victim of multiple crimes committed by my mother. If you think I should prioritize protecting the person who committed those crimes over supporting the person who was harmed by them, then you don't understand what marriage means or what my father taught me about standing up for what's right." The reactions to Delilah's arrest became a litmus test that revealed the true character of everyone in our lives. Those who supported us understood that crimes have consequences regardless of family relationships. Those who opposed us revealed themselves to be enablers who valued the appearance of family unity over justice, truth, and basic human decency. The legal process that followed Delilah's arrest was both more complex and more revealing than any of us had anticipated. While we'd expected some family pushback, we hadn't prepared for the coordinated campaign that Rachel and her supporters launched to pressure us into dropping the charges. 3 days after Delilah's arrest, Rachel showed up at her house uninvited with Trevor and Margaret in tow. They arrived at 7 p.m. on Sunday evening, clearly hoping to catch us off guard and overwhelm us with their combined emotional manipulation. When I opened the front door, Rachel immediately pushed past me into our living room without being invited inside. "We need to talk," Rachel announced, positioning herself in front of our fireplace like she was preparing to give a speech. "This has gone far enough. Mom is sitting in jail because of your pride, Cassandra, and it's time for you to be the bigger person and fix this." Margaret nodded approvingly. "We've talked to a lawyer, dear. He says that if you withdraw your complaint and refuse to cooperate with the prosecution, they'll have to drop the charges. The family is prepared to make this right. We'll get your jewelry back and pay for any counseling or therapy you think you need to get over this little incident." The casual way she referred to a home invasion and theft as a little incident was infuriating, but I kept my voice calm. The jewelry has already been sold, and this wasn't an incident. It was a series of premeditated crimes that Delilah planned for months. Trevor stepped forward, trying to play the role of reasonable peacemaker. Look, we all agree that what Delilah did was wrong, but sending her to prison isn't going to solve anything. She's already suffered enough, losing Robert and now facing the humiliation of being arrested. Haven't you gotten enough revenge? This isn't about revenge, Jonathan said firmly. It's about consequences. Mom broke multiple laws, and she needs to face the legal system just like anyone else would. Anyone else didn't raise the son who's betraying her, Rachel shot back. Jonathan, I can't believe Dad's son would choose some woman he's known for 6 years over the mother who sacrificed everything for him. I'd heard enough. Get out of my house, I said, standing up and pointing toward the door. All of you. You're not welcome here. Rachel's mask of righteous concern slipped completely. You can't throw family out, Cassandra. This isn't your family's house. It's a Brennan family home, and you're just the outsider who married into it. Actually, Austin's voice came from behind them, this is Jonathan and Cassandra's house that they bought with their own money. And you're trespassing. None of us had heard Austin arrive, but there he was in the doorway, still in his military fatigues, looking every inch the trained soldier he was. His presence immediately changed the dynamic in the room. Austin, thank God you're here, Rachel said, apparently thinking he would support her position. Talk some sense into your brother. Tell him that family doesn't destroy family over money. Austin stepped fully into the room, his expression cold and professional. Family doesn't steal from family either, Rachel. And family doesn't break into houses to commit felonies. What Mom did wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. It was a calculated crime, and she needs to face the consequences. She's your mother, Margaret practically shrieked. She was my mother, Austin corrected. The woman who raised me would never have done what she did. The woman who raised me taught me that actions have consequences and that honor means doing the right thing even when it's difficult. The argument continued for another 20 minutes, with Rachel, Trevor, and Margaret alternating between emotional appeals, threats, and attempts at guilt manipulation. They threatened to turn the entire extended family against us, to make sure we were excluded from all future gatherings, to tell everyone that we'd chosen greed over family loyalty. Austin finally ended the confrontation by informing them that he was recording the conversation on his phone and that if they didn't leave immediately, he would report them for harassment and trespassing. As they stormed out, Rachel turned back for one final attack. You think you've won, but you haven't, she snarled at me. This family will never accept you now. You've made yourself an enemy of every Brennan who matters. Good, I replied. If they're the kind of people who support crime when it's committed by family members, then I don't want their acceptance. The legal proceedings moved forward despite the family pressure. Delilah was formally charged with burglary in the first degree, theft in the first degree, and criminal trespass in the first degree. Her bail was set at $50,000, an amount she couldn't possibly afford given her financial situation. Rachel started a crowdfunding campaign online to raise money for Delilah's bail, painting her as a grieving widow who had made a desperate mistake and was now being persecuted by an unforgiving daughter-in-law. The campaign raised less than $800, mostly from distant relatives who didn't know the full story. More concerning was the harassment campaign that Rachel orchestrated through social media. She created posts on Facebook claiming that I had destroyed an innocent woman's life over jealousy and greed. She shared selective details that made it sound like Delilah had borrowed some jewelry and was being prosecuted for a simple misunderstanding. When Austin saw these posts, his response was swift and devastating. He posted the actual police report, complete with details about the months of planning, the break-in video evidence, and Delilah's confession. He also shared screenshots of Delilah's computer searches and her handwritten notes calculating my jewelry's value. For anyone sharing or believing my sister's version of events, here are the actual facts. Our mother committed multiple felonies after months of planning. She broke into my brother's house and stole $25,000 worth of jewelry. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a desperate mistake. It was a calculated crime, and anyone who thinks family relationships should protect people from the consequences of committing felonies is welcome to explain that philosophy to the victims of domestic violence, child abuse, and elder abuse. Austin's post was shared hundreds of times and effectively ended Rachel's social media campaign. Several people who had initially supported Delilah deleted their posts and apologized for not knowing the full story. The district attorney's office assigned our case to prosecutor Jennifer Walsh, a veteran attorney who specialized in white-collar crimes and domestic theft cases. When we met with her to discuss the case, she was both professional and reassuring. I want you to know that this is one of the most well-documented cases I've ever seen. Between the video evidence, the computer searches, the financial records, and the confession, this is essentially a slam-dunk prosecution. The defendant's family relationships are irrelevant to the legal proceedings. Prosecutor Walsh also warned us about the pressure we might face to drop the charges. In family theft cases, we often see organized campaigns to pressure victims into withdrawing their cooperation. I want you to understand that these charges are being brought by the state, not by you personally. Even if you wanted to drop them at this point, you couldn't. The evidence is too strong and the crime's too serious. This was actually a relief to hear, because it meant that Rachel's threats and manipulation tactics were pointless. The legal system would move forward regardless of family pressure.
During the pre-trial phase, Delilah's court-appointed attorney tried several different strategies to minimize her culpability. First, he attempted to argue that she was suffering from grief-induced mental illness that had impaired her judgment. This strategy collapsed when the prosecution presented evidence of her months of careful planning and research. Next, the defense tried to claim that Delilah had intended to return the jewelry after selling it to pay her debts. This argument was undermined by the fact that she had made no provisions for tracking the jewelry sale or arranging its return. Finally, the defense attempted to portray Delilah as a victim of predatory casino practices that had exploited her vulnerability as a grieving widow. While there might have been some truth to this claim, it didn't excuse her decision to commit crimes against innocent family members. Throughout this process, Austin became our primary liaison with law enforcement and the prosecutor's office. His military background and clear communication style made him effective at providing information and ensuring that the legal system had everything it needed to move forward. Jonathan struggled more with the emotional aspects of prosecuting his mother, but he never wavered in his support for seeing the process through to completion. "I keep thinking about what Dad would want," he told me one evening. "He raised us to believe that doing the right thing matters more than protecting people from the consequences of their choices." The most difficult part of this phase was dealing with the ongoing harassment from Rachel and her supporters. They seemed to believe that if they could make our lives miserable enough, we would eventually give in and drop our cooperation with the prosecution. They were wrong, but their efforts took a real toll on our emotional well-being and our sense of security. Delilah's trial was scheduled for October, but in late September, her defense attorney approached Prosecutor Walsh with a plea deal proposal. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of a lengthy prison sentence if convicted at trial, Delilah was finally ready to accept responsibility for her crimes, or at least she was ready to accept the consequences to avoid worse ones. The plea agreement required Delilah to plead guilty to all charges: burglary in the first degree, theft in the first degree, and criminal trespass in the first degree. In exchange for her guilty plea, the prosecution agreed to recommend a sentence of 18 months in state prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. She would also be required to pay full restitution for the jewelry, plus court costs and legal fees.
Prosecutor Walsh called us to explain the plea deal and get our input before making a final decision. I want you to understand that this agreement saves everyone the time and expense of a trial, but it also means she'll serve less time than she might receive if convicted by a jury. However, the restitution requirement is significant, and the felony conviction will remain on her record permanently. Austin was initially opposed to the plea deal, feeling that Delilah deserved a harsher sentence for her premeditated crimes. She spent months planning this. She violated our home, our trust, our security. 18 months seems light for someone who showed such calculated malice. But Jonathan and I ultimately supported accepting the plea agreement. We were exhausted from months of legal proceedings and family harassment, and we wanted closure more than we wanted maximum punishment. The guilty plea would also mean that Delilah would have to publicly admit her crimes in court, which felt important for our sense of justice. The plea hearing took place on October 15th in Millfield County Superior Court. Delilah appeared in an Orange County Jail jumpsuit, having been unable to make bail throughout the pre-trial period. She looked older and more fragile than I remembered, her hair unkempt and her face drawn from months of stress and incarceration. Judge Patricia Morrison presided over the hearing with the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who had seen every type of criminal excuse over her 20-year career. When she asked Delilah to state her plea, there was a long pause before Delilah finally whispered, "Guilty, Your Honor." "Mrs. Brennan, I need you to speak clearly for the record. How do you plead to the charge of burglary in the first degree?" "Guilty," Delilah said, louder this time. "And how do you plead to the charge of theft in the first degree?" "Guilty. And to the charge of criminal trespass in the first degree?" "Guilty." Judge Morrison then required Delilah to allocate, to describe her crimes in her own words and acknowledge that she understood what she had done. This was the moment I had both dreaded and anticipated, because it would force Delilah to publicly admit the truth about her actions. "Mrs. Brennan," the judge said, "please tell the court what you did on May 2nd of this year." Delilah's voice was barely audible as she began speaking. I went to my son's house when I knew he and his wife weren't home. I used a spare key to enter their house without permission. I went to their bedroom and took a jewelry box containing valuable antique jewelry belonging to my daughter-in-law." "And what did you do with that jewelry?" Judge Morrison prompted. "I sold it to a jewelry buyer in Portland for cash." "How much did you receive for the stolen jewelry?" $19,400. "And what did you do with that money?" "I used it to pay gambling debts and other bills." The judge asked several more questions to ensure that Delilah understood the full scope of her crimes and the consequences of her guilty plea. Throughout this process, Delilah never looked in our direction, keeping her eyes fixed on the floor or the judge. When Judge Morrison imposed the agreed-upon sentence of 18 months in state prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation, she also delivered some pointed comments about the nature of Delilah's crimes. "Mrs. Brennan," the judge said, "what you did was particularly heinous because you violated the trust of family members who welcomed you into their home and their lives. You spent months planning these crimes, studying your victims' routines, and calculating how to maximize your profit from their possessions. This wasn't a crime of desperation or passion. It was a calculated betrayal of people who loved you." The judge also addressed the restitution requirement, which would be challenging for Delilah to meet given her financial situation. "You are ordered to pay restitution in the amount of $25,000 to compensate the victims for their stolen property.
This debt will not be discharged by bankruptcy, and failure to make payment arrangements will result in additional criminal charges. After the sentencing, we learned more about what had happened to my grandmother's jewelry. The buyer in Portland, Marcus Chen, had cooperated fully with law enforcement and still had most of the pieces in his possession. However, he had already resold the Victorian sapphire necklace to a private collector in California, and recovering it would require additional legal proceedings. Mr. Chen agreed to return the pieces he still had at cost, meaning we would need to pay him the $19,400 he had given Delilah to get back jewelry worth $25,000. The difference represented not just financial loss, but the emotional trauma of having to buy back my own stolen inheritance. Austin immediately offered to pay the recovery costs, but Jonathan and I insisted on handling it ourselves. We had insurance coverage that would help with some of the costs, and we felt it was important to take responsibility for our own recovery, rather than placing that burden on Austin. The most valuable piece, the sapphire necklace that had belonged to my great-great-grandmother, remained with the collector in California who had purchased it in good faith. Our insurance company's legal department was working to recover it, but the process would likely take months and might ultimately require us to compensate the innocent purchaser for his costs. Rachel's reaction to her mother's sentencing was predictably hostile. She posted on social media that the injustice system had failed her family and that we had destroyed an innocent woman's life over material possessions. She claimed that Delilah's guilty plea had been coerced and that she planned to appeal the sentence. However, Rachel's legal threats were empty bluster. There was no basis for an appeal when Delilah had entered a voluntary guilty plea in exchange for a reduced sentence. Rachel's continued public statements were more about maintaining her own narrative than about pursuing any realistic legal strategy. The most difficult aspect of this phase was dealing with the ongoing division in Jonathan's extended family. Some relatives, particularly the older generation, continued to view us as the villains who had destroyed the family by refusing to handle Delilah's crimes privately. Others, especially younger family members who had witnessed Austin's evidence presentation, supported our decision to prosecute. This division led to awkward situations at family gatherings and holidays. We were uninvited from Rachel's birthday party and Trevor's retirement celebration, but we were welcomed at Peter's wedding and his parents' anniversary party. The Brennan family had essentially split into two camps, with each side viewing the other as morally wrong. Austin handled these family politics with characteristic directness. When relatives tried to pressure him to convince us to forget and forget, he would simply state, "My mother committed serious crimes against my brother and his wife. Anyone who thinks family relationships should protect people from the consequences of criminal behavior is welcome to disagree with me, but they shouldn't expect me to change my position." For Jonathan, the family division was emotionally devastating. He had grown up believing that family unity was one of the most important values, and watching that unity shatter over his mother's crimes challenged his fundamental understanding of what family meant. I keep thinking about what Dad would say about all this. He told me one evening as we walked through the neighborhood where we'd built our life together. He always taught us that family comes first, but I don't think he meant that families should protect each other from facing consequences for doing wrong. The legal resolution of Delilah's case brought us closure, but it also marked a new chapter in our lives, one where we would have to rebuild our sense of family and security from the ground up. 2 years have passed since Delilah's sentencing, and the lessons we learned from this experience have fundamentally changed how we approach relationships, trust, and family loyalty.
Delilah was released from prison after serving 14 months and is now living in a supervised halfway house in Portland, working part-time at a discount retail store to meet her restitution obligations. She has made no attempt to contact any of us, and we have no desire to reconnect with her. The most important lesson I learned is that trust, once broken by deliberate betrayal, cannot simply be rebuilt through apologies or family pressure. Before this experience, I believed that forgiveness was always possible and that family relationships could overcome any obstacle if people were willing to work at it. I now understand that some violations are so fundamental that they permanently alter the nature of a relationship. Delilah didn't just steal my jewelry. She spent months studying our lives, planning her attack, and calculating how to exploit our trust for her personal gain. This wasn't a mistake or a moment of desperation. It was a deliberate choice to prey on people who loved her.
The financial recovery process taught us practical lessons about protecting ourselves that I wish we'd known earlier. We eventually recovered about $18,000 worth of the stolen jewelry, but the Victorian sapphire necklace, the most historically significant piece, remains with the collector in California. Our insurance company determined that pursuing its recovery would cost more than the necklace's appraised value, so we've had to accept that it's gone forever. This loss taught me that some things truly are irreplaceable, regardless of their monetary value. The necklace had been in my family for over a century, connecting me to generations of strong women who had worn it during their most important moments. No amount of money could restore that historical continuity once it was broken. We've since taken much more serious security measures. Our home now has a comprehensive alarm system with cameras, motion sensors, and direct police monitoring. We no longer keep spare keys hidden outside, and we've changed our approach to sharing personal information with extended family members. These precautions feel sad and necessary. Evidence of how one person's betrayal can force you to view the world with permanent suspicion. Austin completed his military service 6 months ago and has moved to Millfield permanently, taking a job with a private security company. His experience with exposing Delilah's crimes led him to specialize in investigating financial fraud and identity theft cases. He's told us that family-perpetrated theft is far more common than most people realize, and that victims often struggle with reporting crimes committed by relatives. The military taught me that loyalty has to be earned and maintained, Austin explained during a recent family dinner. Real loyalty means holding people accountable when they do wrong, not protecting them from consequences. Mom lost the right to our loyalty when she chose to betray it. Austin's perspective has been crucial in helping Jonathan process the guilt and confusion he felt about prosecuting his mother. Jonathan spent months wondering if we'd been too harsh, if we should have found a way to handle things privately, if a real family would have protected Delilah despite her crimes. The turning point came when Austin shared some research he'd done about family crime statistics. Do you know what happens to families that cover up crimes committed by their members? He asked Jonathan. The criminal behavior escalates because there are no consequences. The victims suffer in silence because speaking up means being blamed for destroying family unity. And other family members become targets because the criminal knows they can get away with it. This information helped Jonathan understand that prosecuting Delilah hadn't destroyed our family. Delilah's crimes had destroyed it. Our decision to seek justice was about protecting ourselves and preventing future victims, not about revenge or lack of forgiveness. The family division that resulted from this situation has been permanent, but it's also been clarifying. We've learned who in our extended network truly supports us versus who prioritizes maintaining comfortable illusions over confronting difficult truths. Rachel and Trevor continued to blame us for tearing apart the family, but their criticism has lost all power over us because we know their values are fundamentally different from ours. Some relationships have grown stronger through this crisis. Peter and his parents have become much closer to us, and we've developed friendships with other family members who were previously more distant. These relationships are built on shared values of honesty, accountability, and mutual respect, rather than just blood connections. Jonathan and I have also grown stronger as a couple through navigating this crisis together. We learned that we can count on each other when facing external pressure, and that our marriage can withstand attacks from people who want to divide us. The experience tested our communication skills, our problem-solving abilities, and our commitment to supporting each other through difficult times. We've started volunteering with a local victims' rights organization, sharing our story with other people who have been victimized by family members. Many of these victims struggle with the same guilt and confusion we experienced, wondering if they're being too harsh by seeking justice, feeling pressure to forgive and forget, or believing that family loyalty requires accepting criminal behavior. Our message to these victims is always the same. You are not responsible for protecting people from the consequences of their choices to harm you. Family relationships do not create special obligations to tolerate criminal behavior. And seeking justice is not revenge, it's setting boundaries and protecting yourself and others from future harm. The most profound lesson I've learned is about the difference between biological family and chosen family. Being related by blood doesn't automatically create loyalty, love, or trustworthiness. Those qualities have to be demonstrated through actions, maintained through consistent behavior, and renewed through mutual respect. Our real family now consists of people who have proven themselves through their response to a crisis. Austin, who chose justice over family politics, Peter and his parents who supported us despite pressure to stay neutral, our friends and colleagues who offered practical and emotional support, and each other, as we've built a marriage strong enough to withstand external attacks. For anyone facing a similar situation, my advice is this: trust your instincts when someone's behavior feels wrong, even if they're family. Document suspicious activity and protect your valuable possessions. Don't let family loyalty become a weapon that others use against you. Understand that some people will always prioritize maintaining comfortable lies over confronting uncomfortable truths, and their criticism says more about their character than yours.
Most importantly, remember that you deserve relationships based on mutual respect, honesty, and genuine care for your well-being. Anyone who asks you to tolerate criminal behavior, abuse, or betrayal for the sake of family unity is asking you to sacrifice your own safety and dignity to protect someone who has chosen to harm you. Delilah made her choices. We made ours. 2 years later, we're living in a home we feel secure in, surrounded by people we trust completely, with a marriage stronger than ever. Meanwhile, Delilah is alone, working minimum wage to pay restitution for crimes that destroyed her relationships with the people who once loved her. That's not our fault, and it's not our responsibility to fix. Some bridges, once burned, should stay burned. And sometimes, protecting yourself and your future is more important than preserving relationships with people who have proven they don't deserve your trust. The most beautiful jewelry in the world isn't worth as much as peace of mind, genuine relationships, and the knowledge that you stood up for yourself when it mattered most. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.